30 this morning, and just connecting with my wife on live with the Louhs. So anyway, but welcome again, everyone, to being with us at Live with the Louhs. We're so excited you're with us. And if you happen to be new to our show, or this is your first time listening, it's a show that merges both faith and psychology. We hope and pray that it kind of gives you some guiding principles to live by in your own walk of faith. And if you're just if you're someone that's been part of our show, we want to just thank you so much for being part of the Louhs family. You know, before we start dive into tonight's topic, I do want to just invite you all to stay connected to us all throughout the week on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook and Twitter and, Instagram and YouTube, all under the headings of the Louhs. And in fact, you would do us a great privilege and pleasure if you would go and subscribe to our Louhs YouTube channel. It's very easy. Just go to youtube.com and then simply put in the Louhs, and that last name is spelled Louhs. And we also invite you to check out our website at thelouhs.com. Hopefully we'll have some surprises coming there very soon on our website that we'll share with all of you hopefully in a couple of weeks. And also we'd love to have you subscribe to our daily inspirational messages that we send out every day in your email inbox. You can subscribe to them by going to our website at thelouhs.com. Click on that subscribe button, which is in the top right corner, and then all you have to do is simply put in your email address, and every day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll receive that day's daily inspirational message. And as always, we'd love to hear from you, so please call us if you've got a question or a comment or just something that you'd like to share with us. We always love hearing from you. Our phone number is 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And you can also leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube channel. As they're broadcasting this show, you can leave a comment there, and our amazing producer, Matushka Trudy, will share that with us. And also, friends, just before we start, I do want to remind all of you about our new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons. It's got it's been received so beautifully. We're so excited about that. If you've read the book or you're in the process of reading it and you like it, do us a favor, write a review on Ancient Faith's website, on their store website, as well as on Amazon's website. That just helps us to know how well the book is doing, and we'd love to hear from you with that. So just definitely take advantage of that. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about our show and more importantly about my recent pilgrimage through the footsteps of St. Paul. Just over the last several hours, I got back into town and visited with about 40 of some amazing people from our church and a little bit outside of our church, in which we all traveled through the footsteps of St. Paul, and specifically in Greece. And I want to talk to you about all of that this evening.
So let's jump in. I am so excited and curious about the details of this trip. I know we sort of tried in little snippets and moments to check in, but, this is the footsteps of St. Paul, the journey, if you will, throughout his life. And I'm sure a lot of the biblical stories that we read about really came to life for you on this journey. But maybe you could share a little bit about why you chose to take this specific journey. Because there are so many pilgrimages, right? Mm-hmm. What made you choose the footsteps of St. Paul?
Roxanne, as you know, we try to do a pilgrimage every few years, and it really kind of brings to life so much of what we see in the scriptures. I mean, we take the time every day to read scripture, to grow in our faith. We hear about it in sermons. We hear about it in our divine liturgy, in the readings that we read from the church fathers. But it's one thing to read it and then another thing to actually see it. And one of the things that I'm a very visual person, as you know very well, and I love to be able to kind of put into place what I've been reading and what we're actually now seeing, and putting that in that correlation so that people remember not only just what they've read, but what those things impacted, what the geographical location, how significant that was. And in this particular case, when we were covering St. Paul's footsteps, it's extraordinary when you start looking at cities like Philippi and Thessalonica, when we go into Corinth. I mean, it's one thing to read about these books when we hear St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians or the Thessalonians, but when you're actually there, Roxanne, it's extraordinary. And to see that, because oftentimes we just kind of visualize in our own mind what these places look like, but when you're actually there, you're walking on that soil, walking, in those footsteps and seeing that soil, it's extraordinary. And so, we started the pilgrimage off. It was a 10-day pilgrimage in which we started off in Thessalonica, or Thessalonica, as we say in the Greek language. And it was just amazing to see all of the, to see where St. Paul went and how, in the areas that he spoke to and in the times that he spoke with and how difficult the terrain was that he was walking through. Really, really powerful experience for us.
Tell us a little bit about this sort of first, so we started in Thessalonica. What stood out to you?
Well, the very first part of the trip, Roxanne, we spent time in Thessalonica, and specifically in Thessalonica. So Thessalonica is the, if you will, the half-sister of Alexander the Great. So that's why it's called Thessaloniki. It's his sister. And so what's extraordinary about Thessalonica is it was one of the capitals of the northern part of what we call Greece now, Macedonia, in that area. And it was a place that was so rich, so powerful in what it offered, not only to the community, to the Romans at that time, but obviously to Alexander. And what Alexander the Great would do is he basically would Hellenize that region from Greece all the way to northern India, to northwestern India. And when he did that, he Hellenized this region. That's why we called it, one of the beauties of how that Alexander the Great, who was obviously, we're talking about 300 years before Christ had come to this earth. He Hellenized that entire region, and how that becomes significant for us as Christians is we often wonder, why was the Bible written in Greek when most of the disciples were Jewish, or for that matter, Christ? It's because of when Alexander the Great came there, he Hellenized it so that the common language there at that time was Greek. So what English is today around the world, we would say it's a language that's becoming more universal around the world, is what Greek was back then. And it's so important to realize that, so that these disciples would write, obviously St. Paul writing his letters, would write them in the Greek language, because in large part of what Alexander the Great had done in Hellenizing that region. And it's amazing, St. Paul, being a major leader within the Roman governance, but also a Jewish, a faithful Jewish person, and as many people had remarked, many historians had remarked, that St. Paul was really on the fast track to being a major, significant figure within all of Judaism at that time. When he has this extraordinary experience on the road to Damascus, in which he hears the voice of God saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you continue to crucify me? Why are you crucifying me?" And it was such a powerful thing that he's blinded, as you remembered. And when we went to Syria, Roxanne, we remember almost over a decade ago, how he
walked that road.
Yeah, he would walk a tremendous path to the home of Ananias. Mm-hmm. And ultimately through, he would be, the scales off of his eyes would be revealed, and he would be able to see, and it could transformed his life. And so when we were in Thessalonica this time, you could see just how powerful it was for him to be able to and how significant that place was for him to go to and to begin sharing that message of Christ in a time in which it was, we have to keep in mind this, friends, that it was illegal to be a Christian. Christianity, there's an edict of Milan that many of you who are Orthodox Christians may be aware of, that was an edict by Constantine the Great that basically allowed the toleration of Christians. But the actual Christianity being the official religion of the Roman Empire does not happen at that time. It happens almost 70 years later, close to 390 AD. So for all these years, it's illegal to be a Christian. So when you go to Thessalonica, and then shortly thereafter we would go into Philippi, where St. Paul, while he was in Philippi, we would walk into a large theater, Roxanne, and this theater would fill thousands and thousands of people. They still have, in the center of this theater, Roxanne, a large area where they would keep all of the animals, the lions, the tigers, that they would pull back these little coverings that were under the amphitheater. And as our Christian brothers back then, the martyrs, would be gladiators at that time, they would pull this thing back, and the people would be spectators watching as these Christians, who could have easily chosen not to profess their faith, could have easily chosen not to die that way, would be tortured and obviously killed by the animals that were there, that the Romans would love to do and set as an example to those Christians. And you would think that that would have stopped Christianity, but it didn't. Quite the opposite. And St. Paul would go to that area, Roxanne, and would preach in those areas, knowing
this,
that what was going to happen.
I mean, how incredible. How early was Thessalonica in St. Paul's ministry? Obviously, he was not in prison until Philippi, I would imagine.
Right. So he goes actually to Philippi before going to Thessalonica. So when you go to Philippi, which we actually walked on the city of Philippi, which is extraordinary. Obviously I mentioned earlier about the theater, but also just the extraordinary landscape of that. So when you go into where Philippi is, it's amazing how in the early Christian church they would build basilicas on top of the prison that St. Paul was held at. And that prison, Roxanne, is just a small, it's different than what we would understand as a jail cell in today's world. These were oftentimes lower in the ground. They would be areas that would be oftentimes no circulation, no ventilation. There's no windows to look through, just simply a concrete block, and you were stuck in the middle of it. So it's beautiful that the Orthodox Church would build these churches over where St. Paul was
where he was imprisoned.
Where he was imprisoned. And we remember in the book of Acts, such an extraordinary book that really, Acts 16 through 19, really kind of opened the entire door of St. Paul's ministry. But when he was in Philippi, and as you remember in Acts 16, when he's basically this sorcerer, as the scriptures talk about, or some called even a fortune teller, but someone that was really possessed with a demon possession, but was making money for other people, when she confronts St. Paul, and he basically rids her of this possession that she's has been compelled by. That when they do that, obviously the people that own this woman, she's a slave, she's basically a servant to these men, they end up complaining to the leadership, and then they throw Paul and Silas in jail. And what's beautiful, Roxanne, is while they're in jail, we remember how when they're in the middle of the night and God speaks to them and ultimately frees them, that when the doors open, these people come out of this. They could have easily chose to run away, but they stay there. And the prisoner, the prison guard at that time, we don't know his name. We just simply know, at least in Scripture, we don't know his name. But we know that he was so tormented when he saw that that the chains were no longer on them. And back then, which I didn't realize this, back then, if you were a prison guard and you had allowed a prisoner to be free, it was punishable by your death. Mm-hmm. And so here he was reaching for the sword, which we see in Scripture, but chooses, but St. Paul intervenes and says, stop that. You don't need to do that. And then he says, how can I be saved? And it's such an extraordinary experience. So we were there at that place where the shackles were released and freed, and Paul and Silas, as we hear in Scripture, were singing joys and singing gratitude. And prior to that moment, we all know that the very first Christian that was baptized was a woman named Lydia. We hear about her. The very first Christian that's recorded in Scripture that in Europe that was baptized was that of Lydia. And what an amazing story. We actually went to where she was baptized, and an amazing person as well. And so oftentimes in the Orthodox tradition, Roxanne, Lydia is the first person that's baptized. The second person, we would say, is that prison guard.
Wow. So she opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited people to her home, invited Paul to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. Mm-hmm. And she persuaded us. Talk to us about that.
Well, I mean, we don't know much about Lydia other than that she was selling very wealthy kind of material and cloth, purple cloth. But what's astounding about this is that, this is, again, in the settings of recognizing that Christianity is illegal. To be even associated with a Christian would be by death. And just on a side note, for those of you that are maybe interested in Christianity or maybe interested more in the Orthodox Church, one of the things I would tell you is, this is where we get all of those ancient Christian symbols of the fish, of the anchor, of the dove. All these things kind of come to place at these times because it's illegal to be a Christian, and they would put symbols on these different walls or on the ground to remind people of different things, either what time of service would be, or that this is a home of a Christian, or that this is a safe area. You can only imagine all the things that they would share. So Lydia, a woman back in that day, who professes her faith, and you have to remember also this is also extraordinarily important, is that women were considered to be property of a man. They did not have rights like that of a man. They didn't own they weren't they not only were they property, but they did not have the opportunity to own property. They were considered to be less than that of a man. So here this woman takes this extraordinary risk during a time in which it's illegal to be a Christian. So just kind of factor that. If you lived in a society where it's absolutely illegal to be a Christian, and it could be punishable by death, to associate herself with a man, St. Paul, who is someone that is now on everyone's most wanted list. They are after him. And for her to open up her house and to allow him, I think shows the extraordinary courage that she has, but also the opening up her heart to Christ. That Paul's message must have been so convincing to her, Roxanne, that she was willing to say, you come into my house, let me show you hospitality, knowing that people were going to hear about that, and ultimately that there would be consequences to that.
I mean, I think as I listen to, characters in the Bible at this stage of life, how willing they were to confess or profess their faith and to open their heart to Christ, how strong the message they were hearing had to have been, and how miraculous the things they were witnessing had to be. I mean, for them to put themselves in, at risk like this, nobody would say yes to something that they knew would endanger their life unless what they saw and what they heard was something so comforting and so profound that it didn't matter, that they would be putting themselves at risk.
Well, and that's the thing that I love that you're sharing that, Roxanne, because I think for so many of us, we kind of get to this point where we're like kind of looking back at this history, and it becomes history for us. But if one of the beauties of going on a pilgrimage is that you're actually there and you see and you experience. But I will tell you that on a personal level, one of the things that has convicted me so much in my own personal faith with Christ is, especially when our dads passed away and when we were going through all those difficulties, is recognizing that, what made these people, these were these 12 men, they were fishermen, these women that were at the cross, what made them so convicted in their faith that they would be willing, many of them, to die horrific deaths if they did not know without a shadow of a doubt that there was a living God. I tell people all the time, we are the body, but Christ is the head. And because he's the head, he leads us only if we allow him to do so. I mean, St. Peter was a married man. He wasn't a celibate. He was a married man. For him to leave his wife, his family behind, and to die the way that he would die, it's unbelievable, unless he knew in his heart that, and seen with his eyes and believed with all of his being, that God did rise, that Christ did rise from the dead, and that he's a living God that we worship. He's not a dead God. And that for me is so important. And I think that for Paul, as we were walking in his footsteps and seeing people like Lydia and others who would die in that amphitheater where thousands, I think some of the numbers said that around 20,000 people would be spectators watching this.
So Lydia was one of the ones.
Not Lydia, but she knew that if she was to become a Christian, that would be a faith that she could experience. But many other people did experience that. I mean, we say the life of St. Demetrius in Thessalonica, one of the most magnificent churches, the most visited church in Thessalonica is that of St. Demetrius Church. And Roxanne, underneath the church itself is basically where they tortured St. Demetrius, and they did it in such horrific ways. They threw him down a well, which the bottom of that well leads into the area where he was imprisoned under the church. What would make him convince him and to convict him to continue to follow Christ in the midst of all that? It's easy to talk about how great you love God, when everything is going great in your life. But imagine having being persecuted for that, and
still say yes,
and still say yes, I'm willing to deal with that. And I think that's one of the things that I think we as Christians, especially in the West, that we need to be much more, and really around the world, is continuously asking ourselves, would we know that Christ died for us, but would we be willing to die for Him? And that's the challenge that we have, because as we hear about in scriptures, it says to take up your cross. In other words, we have to die so that we can live.
So why did Paul enter Macedonia?
Well, it's interesting. He in that book of Acts, chapter 16, he receives this vision of this man saying, and there's plenty of icons that share this, but an image of a man saying, "Please come to." In short, I'm abbreviating, but please come to Macedonia. We need you here, and so that would lead him towards Macedonia, and obviously to Thessalonica and to the other areas there. He would go from Philippi to Thessalonica. Would later go on to Corinth. And to the different areas there. Some studies say that he must have traveled anywhere between 8,000 to 12,000 miles when he was in Greece alone.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
8,000 to 12,000 miles.
Yes, yeah, and some have put it a little bit higher than that, but yes.
So tell us about Philippi. Why was this such an important place for Paul? A major Roman province. It was a special place. Tell us about it.
So basically, Philippi, which we know that the book of Philippians is one of our favorite books, a book that we oftentimes use in our books because of what it talks about. And Paul writes this while he's in prison in Rome, by the way. It's one of what we call the 4 prison epistles. But what's interesting about Philippi is that it's a Roman province that you mentioned, Roxanne. So what that means is that when you're part of the Roman province, like being a Roman citizen, by the way, when you're a Roman citizen, not everyone that lives in Rome, by the way, is a Roman citizen. It's a privileged position to be in, by the way. So when you're in Philippi, you are part of this province that has certain blessings, certain privileges that come along with it that are unique. And Philippi was a major province there that allowed for trade, for culture. It was a major area of academics and study and research. And so Paul is there before going to Thessalonica. As we talked about earlier, he's baptizing Lydia. He's being thrown in jail because he heals this person really of this demon possession, and then he breaks through God's grace, those chains are broken. But while he's there, he suffers torment and torture and abuse. And just to kind of give you an idea, what many historians say, Roxanne, is that the way that the Romans would imprison you, especially in Philippi, were that you would have your hands lifted up in the air and your legs spread out like in an X. So you'd almost be like an X shape with your chains stretching your arms to one side and your legs being to the other side. And this would happen not only for a few minutes or a few hours, but for days for St. Paul. And in this area, though, you see the power by which he continues to profess his faith and continues to stand strong in his faith. And he warns the people. This is what's so beautiful. If you're just kind of reading the book of Philippians, you're like going, okay, he said something about this citizenship, that we're the citizens of the kingdom of heaven. Why does he say that when he's talking to the people of Philippi and maybe not in other areas? Because the people of Philippi, in many ways, had this air about themselves, that because they were a Roman province, that they had all these blessings that were given by the pantheon of gods that were there, that they had all these benefits that other people didn't have, that they were gifted by God, that they would, that he remarks that they have made themselves a citizen of this world. They don't realize that they are citizens of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, they need to stop living for what this is, this earth, and start living for the kingdom of God. That's why St. Paul, in the book of Philippians, warns them about not being citizens of this world. And as something that I oftentimes worry about, and I challenge people in the Western countries, is that sometimes we can kind of get this air about ourselves that we live in this blessed place. And yes, there's extraordinary blessings in every country. But sometimes we can kind of own the idea that we're so blessed that we buy into the lie that this is it, that earth is it. And we know better, especially with what Christ did, that earth is not heaven. Heaven is heaven, and we are citizens of that place, not this place.
And so were you able to visit the prison that where he was sort of put in this sort of X position?
Yes, and again, that prison that it was there, it's like, if you were to look at it, it's like on the side of a hill. Above that is this church that later on would be built over that cell. But I'm talking, like saying, a very small space. It wouldn't be larger than a walk-in closet at most. And he'd be in there for, as I mentioned, days. And what's interesting about it is they would oftentimes walk in, they would beat him. He was constantly being beaten and bruised. And, when he is free, it's extraordinary, because when you're a Roman citizen, going back to what I was mentioning earlier, and again, not everyone was a Roman citizen, but when you're a Roman citizen, you can't be treated that way. And he reminds the leaders afterwards that I'm a Roman citizen. I cannot be treated the way that you treated me, but nevertheless, I'm a prisoner for Christ, and that this is what this is my lot. Then so be it.
I mean, it's so incredible. I mean, to think about, his position at this time and all that he faced, and he wrote so much, on this footstep. I mean, how much territory did you cover? If Paul wrote, 2/3 of the New Testament, how much did you cover of his footsteps in terms of his writing? I mean,
when you look at the areas that we visited Ephesus, another extraordinary place where he writes the book of Ephesians, where the letter that he's writing to is to the people of Ephesus. And you see the Corinth, you see, as I mentioned earlier, Athens, Thessalonica, and Philippi, obviously. When you walk that area, as I was mentioning earlier, Roxanne, it's such a tremendous honor to have had that opportunity. And one of the things I love about going on a pilgrimage is also seeing the faces of people who, many of them had never been to Greece before, and kind of associating and seeing their spirituality just kind of grow every single day. The tears that were shed, the beauty that they had in their hearts for that. And one of the things that it helped me do is that sometimes we can get so caught up in what in a very, I don't want to say shallow end of Christianity, because I think that the Orthodox Church is the deep end of the pool, I oftentimes say. But I think just naturally you can kind of just, just the way the brain works, you can kind of at times just kind of settle for a certain level of things that the bandwidth that your brain can comprehend. And then when you kind of add something totally different, it adds a whole other, as we would call a neural pathway, a neural highway that you would have never had before, that really allows you to say, wow, look at the extraordinary the terrain that he walked, the difficulty it was, the illegality of him being a Christian, and what the consequences were that, and yet he still maintained himself. And not only does he maintain himself, Roxanne, he also inspires other people. I mean, you look at people like Luke. I mean, Luke was inspired by Paul. He was a disciple of Paul, and he writes, as we know, the Gospel of Luke. He was a physician. We see about countless other people that are influenced by what Paul does, the courage that he had. And that, to me, is just, it motivates me, is at the end of the day is, our people, when they come across us, are they truly inspired by the way in which we're living our life? Are they wanting to draw closer to Christ? And I think that's one of the things that we need to be always asking ourselves is, do people, when they leave us, feel closer or farther away from God?
Something so important to think about. And when you go back and you witness the life of somebody who truly did empower others and was a true living testimony.
Absolutely.
We're going to take a quick break. And on the other side of this break, we're going to hear about the cruise and the moment the pilgrimage was able to be exposed to Mount Athos. We'll be right back.
Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
Saint Paisios said, "Every day you should try to plant in your soul something spiritual, which will eject something worldly and sinful. Replace the sinful images in your mind with holy ones. AthoniteUSA.com offers holy icons for those wishing to plant something spiritual in their souls. Immaculate 22-karat gold leaf, hand-applied on solid wood. A lifelong gift for yourself and someone you care for. Use the code FAITH for free shipping. Come and see AthoniteUSA.com.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us tonight. Tonight, I'm just spending some time with Roxanne. I got back earlier today from a pilgrimage with 40 of our church members that went along with me on the footsteps of St. Paul in Greece. It was an amazing, amazing trip for all of us. And for tonight, we're just kind of talking about that, sharing with you the stories and what inspired all of us while we were there. And so we're grateful that you're here, but we'd love to hear from you. If you've ever been to Greece and you want to share your own personal experience journeying through the footsteps of St. Paul, feel free to let us know. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or feel free to leave us a question or comment on our Facebook pages, on the Louhs Facebook page, or on Ancient Faith's YouTube page.
So let's talk about Mount Athos. Tell us about this magical, just mystical place. There are something like 20 monasteries there. Is that right?
Yeah, so one of the beautiful things that we had the opportunity to go is to have a private tour or a river, actually a cruise around parts of Mount Athos. And the major port there is called Daphne, and we went, we kind of got close to there, but and then visited just through on the water side, looking up at these extraordinary monasteries that were built, some of them on the sides of mountains, and just extraordinary beauty that was there. And there was something, Roxanne, I will tell you, that even on the boat ride, you know, when you're traveling on the boat with so many other people, you can get loud, it can get talkative. But on that cruise, Roxanne, as we were going there, everyone was just quiet, just observing the beauty of it. And you know, one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about this is the story of how Mount Athos became Mount Athos. I mean, yes, it preceded Christianity. This obviously was a mountain prior to Christianity, but the Aion Oros, as we say in the Greek language, Mount Athos was founded by the Virgin Mary. The tradition is that she was on her way to Cyprus to visit Thomas, and on her way to visit, I think, Andrew, and as on her way there to visit, her and John the Evangelist were in a boat, and the boat basically the winds had moved it towards this peninsula in northern Greece, and when she landed, she was so moved by the beauty of it that she would say that she would pray to God that God would give her this land, to her son, that God would give her this land, and obviously he did, and it becomes known as the Garden of the Virgin Mary. And these extraordinary place, where there's 20 monasteries and many other little cells that many monks will live just in total quietness or in privacy. But while there, as we were traveling, you could not help to feel this level of spirituality, even though we were in a boat and they were obviously on land. And there was one moment, Roxanne, while we were in the boat, that we were blessed to have one of the monks from the monastery of St. Paul that's there on Mount Athos to come out. And it was just beautiful watching this monk coming up on this beautiful little boat. I
think I saw you have a video for those of you listening. There is a video of him showing this monk coming down from Mount Athos to the boat.
Yes, and he comes to the boat, and just again in very quietness, his very soft voice, but he revealed to us and brought us some of the relics from this particular monastery, and it was unbelievable. They have a piece of the cross of Christ, and we were able to venerate that. They have relics of Saint Panteleimon, Saint Andrew, one of the 12 disciples, Saint there relics of Saint John the Baptist. There were Saint Nectarios there, so many different saints that were there, and again, I was just so it was just such a beautiful experience, so not only for myself but also to watch the faces of the pilgrims that were there with us as they saw this experience and were able to venerate, and each of them were so just moved by it. And it was so beautiful that the monk brought all these prayer bracelets, and he would take every one of us and allow us to put, and he would take the bracelets, Roxanne, and would take them over and wipe them over every one of the relics and then give them back to us. It was just a beautiful experience for us, and something that I'll treasure for a lifetime.
And watching him bless you all multiple times as he bid farewell was just a beautiful
His name was
moment.
Father Avram, and as he was leaving, countless times did he look back at us and to bless the way the priest would bless, and in an extraordinary just level of humility, but also of just sharing with us the grace of Christ. It was just a beautiful experience. Something, as I mentioned, it was one of the hallmark picture moments that you have in life. That's definitely one of them.
Mm-hmm. We had a question come in about the epistle reading yesterday in the Acts of the Apostles. There mentions a synagogue in Thessalonica where Paul actually went in and began speaking and explaining, and proving that it was necessary for Christ to suffer and rise from the dead. And the writer is asking, did you go into that synagogue?
The synagogue, when we were in Thessalonica, we did not go into. I'm not too sure if that synagogue still exists. We were told about it, and as many of you know, there was a large Jewish presence there actually quite recently in Thessalonica. In fact, there's a memorial there to the victims of the Holocaust that were there in Thessalonica. So there was always a Jewish presence in this city of Thessaloniki, which was quite extraordinary and beautiful to see as well, and still is a small Jewish community there in Thessaloniki. But no, we didn't. I'm not too sure that place still exists.
You also visited Aegina, the monastery of Saint Nectarios, as well as the burial site of Saint Paisios and his godfather, Saint Arsenios. I would love to hear about this. Speaking of those who may have watched the movie about Saint Nectarios, which was so incredibly
a man of God.
Powerful, a man of God. If you have not watched it, I will never forget the moment when one of the students at the school was acting up and creating conflict, and was brought to him. And Saint Nectarios, instead of disciplining this kid, says, well, then I must fast. Like, until you end this, I will fast. Like, I will take the punishment in order that you all, and when it's done, then I'll stop. How powerful that moment was. Instead of insisting on change in another person, he took what, you would think would have been given to the students as their punishment. He took it. And just the numerous times his humility was just so palpable. I mean, it made I had goosebumps throughout the whole movie. Like, okay, how can I remember to internalize how this saint responded in moments where it feels almost unnatural. And yet it was just his most obvious and organic response. So tell us about the monastery in Aegina.
You reminded me, Roxanne, we went with one of our tour directors. Her name was Xenia, and she was amazing. All of our tour directors were extraordinary on so many different levels. But, because this is, for those of you that do not know, Saint Nectarios is a modern day saint, and was recently canonized as a saint. And in Aegina, there are people that, because it's modern day, they still would know stories about him. So our director, our tour guide, her grandmother remembers Saint Nectarios, and so she had told our tour director stories, and one was quite very similar to what you had just shared about that we see in the movie. Excuse me. In which there was a time in which this young girl who was an orphan, their parents had left her there. that while she was there, sadly, she was hungry and she wanted something to eat. And so she snuck out of the room and was looking for something to eat. And St. Nectarios was out, and this young girl was walking outside of the orphanage to one of the neighbors' areas. She was going to grab an orange from there. And so the story goes that St. Nectarios says, "Go get it, and I'll watch you to make sure that you're okay." So it's just something so beautiful that to see about his life. But speaking about his life, I mean, I think it's one of those things that we all need to remember, that, you know, sometimes the people that we feel are the closest to us, I guess could sometimes hurt us the most. And that's what happened with St. Nectarios. There were people that are within the church that oftentimes criticized him, ridiculed him, ostracized him, and yet in all of that, his simplicity and his love. I mean, Roxanne, we walked into his bedroom that was probably no bigger than half of the office that we're in right now. His little bed with the sheets that are still there, that were where he was, and then the icon that he would pray to. Again, such a the Virgin Mary that we see as one of the last scenes, by the way, in that movie Man of God that you were referring to earlier. Just to see that, and to see how, again, I guess if the theme that we're hearing over and over today is the courage that both we see in St. Paul and St. Lydia and St. Nectarios, and we'll talk about St. Paisios and St. Arsenio in a moment, but all of these people, Roxanne, they had such an extraordinary amount of courage
and humility at the same time.
Absolutely, in light of everything that was going against them. And sometimes I just think in my own walk of faith that, you know, Nick, do you have that level of courage? Do you have that level to speak and to level to live and to have faith when everything around you could be crumbling, when people around you may be undermining you? And that's like in the case of St. Nectarios, or, in St. Paul's case, where here he was on the top and he was knocked off his horse, and he ended up becoming one of the most extraordinary missionaries of Christianity. I mean, if it's not for Paul, the question is who else would have written all the different letters that he wrote? So all these different things, I think, for me, was just
yet how much oppression they faced.
Yes.
So often when we face oppression, we hit a wall, we face things that are unjust, this is when we sort of struggle to believe. We say, why? Why, God? But if we really want answers for how we are supposed to move through those moments, we just watch the lives of these saints, these individuals, because they were not free of difficulty, persecution, oppression. Even just watching a man of God, you just watch how much worse his life just, kept getting, for St. Nectarios, and the way he responded through it. Like St. Paul is, something that I think our spirit can never tire of watching, and witnessing.
I think that's right. And I think that's the beauty of a church that has the deep end of the pool. That's the beauty of a church. Not that we would ever walk around and say that's in an arrogant way, because at the end of the day, friends, one of the things that we are passionate about is that, we are all on the same team. We are all Christians, but there is something to be said about a church that has the deep end, where you have 2,000 years of the lives of the saints and church tradition and oral tradition, as St. Paul would later on. St. Paul would say this: "I'd stand firm to the written and the oral tradition that I'm sharing with you." So it was never just about simply the Bible.
The oral tradition, meaning
yes,
the words written by these saints.
The words written, but not the words and the orals, the statements that were made by them. So I think it's important for us, that if we're not reading the lives of the saints and the lives of the church, then our faith simply just becomes really one-dimensional, becomes just simply about the Scripture, and we're left to kind of interpret everything through that.
Whatever interpretation we want to make.
But these saints, in many ways, become little signposts for us, these little rest stops, if you will, that every day we have a rest stop when we're learning about St. Lydia, and then later on St. Paisios and St. Arsenio. There are little rest stops that, as we're going every day, that kind of remind us of who we are called to be. And every one of them has a different example about their life that I promise you will read, that much like how you would read the Bible, will read into your own life.
You visited the burial site of Saint Paisios and his godfather, Saint Arsenios. Tell us about Saint Paisios. What was most profound about hearing about his life?
Another one, both Saint Arsenios and Saint Paisios are relative. Saint Paisios especially is a modern day saint. And Saint Arsenios, who is his godfather, is also, Saint Arsenios and St. Paisios are buried in the same location. One is buried in the church, and St. Paisios is buried on a little beautiful ground.
And this is in Aegina.
Not in Aegina. No, this is outside of Thessalonica. And it's just extraordinary when you're seeing St. Paisios' burial. This man that, talk about humility, Roxanne. I mean, this person who just lived their faith and was very much aware of what we are dealing with today. Because sometimes people could say, well, those saints lived so long ago, they're not aware of what's going on now. They were very much aware. They were very, and speak about that, and they talk about that. And, we quote a lot of St. Paisios, and I share a lot of those in my sermons about St. Paisios. But it was a man who walked with humility. I love what he says that when he talks about he speaks a great deal, by the way, on spiritual warfare. And that's something that you're plagued with, like all of us. I would encourage you as the listener tonight to read about the life of St. Paisios. He says that the enemy, one of his quotes says that the enemy is like an anesthetist that comes and gives you a shot only to allow you to fall asleep so that he can come and devour you. So in other words, he gives you this small little sin, this little temptation that you think, oh, it's not a big deal, only so that he can go and devour you so that he can get you to get the bigger sins.
And how true it was. I mean, didn't he die in the 90s?
Yes.
Right. So really, he was living in these sort of very modern times, ministering to us, living with us, from within the confines of the things that we face.
Exactly. And being able to relate to what we're doing and knowing how, his thoughts on our thoughts, just his commentary on our thoughts, Roxanne, when he says that our thoughts are like helicopters or like airplanes. He refers to them, airplanes, wishing to land on the runway of our soul. And in many ways, that's a modern day analogy of how our thoughts are, that for many of us, as we're all throughout the day, we have these thoughts that keep coming into our mind. And he says that you are, in many ways, the person basically allowing what planes will land on your soul or not. You can choose that. You can't stop the planes from coming, but you can you can't choose to whether or not they land on your soul and have an impact over your life.
I mean, and this just, again, so many readings of our church fathers, but, St. Paisios, St. Nectarios, I'm such a fan. And I know we only have about 10 minutes left. I have many more questions. Let's hear about Patmos and the visit to the monastery where St. John received the book of Revelation.
I think that was one of the highlights for me, especially. I've been to a lot of the places that we were visiting in Greece, but never to Patmos. And as you beautifully said, Roxanne, that this is an extraordinary place. One of the things I would share with our listeners is, and again, not in an arrogant way, we just simply share this information, but so many of the sacred and holy sites in all of Christianity are Orthodox churches. And here to see where, if you've ever wondered, where did St. John receive on Patmos the book of Revelation? It's an Orthodox monastery. There are monks that are there. And we actually met Father Isodoros there, and just a beautiful, beautiful soul. But it's extraordinary because you can see where John, who's older in his age at this time when he's receiving the book of Revelation, and keep in mind that in most of the depictions of St. John, whether it be at the Last Supper or even next to Christ at the crucifixion, he's depicted without a beard to symbolize his kind of youthfulness. But we see him in the older icons where he is receiving the book of Revelation considerably older. And St. Prochorus, who is his scribe, we see the area that we're in, in this little cave, which is so small, Roxanne, where you could see where he is writing down this revelation from the words of St. Paul, from the words of St. John, that he is receiving from God to St. Prochorus. It was an extraordinary place. And what I loved about this is, obviously, our church is named St. John the Divine, and but what's interesting is that the original name of our church back in 1916 was called the Apocalypse by St. John the Divine. In other words, the revelation of St. John the Divine. So, and that's because one of our first clergymen were from the island of Patmos, which was great to be there. And I know that many of our community and church family members enjoyed that being there. But just to walk in that place and to see that area and to see and to know that this is where St. John was, someone who saw Christ, someone who experienced Christ, who was one of the 12 that was called by Christ. To be in that position was just really, really an amazing blessing for me. And
so a question came in. It said, why was the Bible written in Greek?
Well, as I was mentioning at the very top of the show, I think that during the time of Alexander the Great, the Old Testament, which at that time wasn't considered an Old Testament, it was just called the Tanakh. That's the formal name of the entire Old Testament. That would be that. What took place is when Alexander the Great Hellenized that region, everyone began to speak Greek. It became the language of the people, so much so that the Jewish people, even prior to Christ being on planet Earth, were so concerned that the Jewish people were no longer speaking in Hebrew, but rather in Greek. This is extraordinary now, that they ended up summoning and creating a group that would write what would be called the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was the Old Testament translated into Greek, and that was actually the same book that in the New Testament, when Jesus is in the temple preaching from the Scripture, it is the Septuagint that he is reading from, and that is the Bible that we as Orthodox Christians still use today. And in fact, if you notice, for those of you that are maybe coming from a Protestant tradition or a non-Orthodox tradition, you may find that when you're looking at the Old Testament, that our book that the Orthodox Church may have more books than that of the that are found in the Western churches, and that's because we still follow a great deal of what the Septuagint is, that original translation of the Old Testament into Greek. Later on, Martin Luther and others would take books out that they felt that were not applicable, that were not needed in the Old Testament, and that's why. And for us as the Orthodox, we didn't take those books out. So that's why we have that Septuagint, and so. Naturally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, the disciples themselves, all of which were Greek, all of which were Jewish people, obviously understood Hebrew. Paul, a Jewish man, yet were all speaking and writing in Greek. And that's why the Greek language, sometimes we minimize the Greek language to just simply a cultural language, and we miss out on truly what the significance is of that. This is a biblical language. This was the language that the Bible was written in, and that Greek is something that is actually very, very important for us to not only understand that the language was written in, but also as best we can try to understand the language itself, because any translation, Roxanne, that you do, as you know, begins to have an editorial opinion about it. It becomes an editor's choice as to how to translate that. So unless you really go back to the original language, that of the Greek language, in this case of the New Testament, you kind of miss out on that.
Really important to have the Greek, the roots of the words that were written in Greek when you're looking for true interpretation. Because, the interpretation changes quite a bit when you turn things over into English. And I imagine, so they were Jewish, but yet Roman citizens who then spoke Greek. And so really the significance of Alexander the Great's conquest and the Hellenism that became so prevalent throughout the world is really sort of where we have arrived at, everything that we're reading today.
And keep in mind that Alexander the Great, like Christ, lived only 33 years. He was a very young man, and so his reign of power was like 13 or 14 years. I can't remember the exact number of years, but the point being is that he didn't have a long time on this earth, and yet he did, Hellenize that region. And again, I think it's one of those things that what my hope and my prayer is that when people are reading the Bible, reading the lives of the saints, reading that of the church fathers, reading obviously the Bible itself and the letters that St. Paul writes, that you recognize that nothing just simply happens in a vacuum or all by itself, that there's all these different other areas. There's the geographic, there's the political, there's the cultural aspects. All these things play a part in how you read the Bible, because if not, you simply just read them through your own interpretation. And sadly, and I mean this in the most respectful way, but we limit God to the size of our own brain, our own personal brain, which is, to be honest with you, is not that big. And so as opposed to looking at all these different areas and then understanding Scripture through that lens. And that takes a lot of work. It's a lot harder doing it this way, but that's the way that we should, because if not, we just kind of, again, just simply take it on surface, on the face value. We interpret it the way we want to, and sometimes mistranslate what parts of the Bible are, sometimes to benefit our own beliefs.
Yeah, I do think so easily, words, Scripture can be taken out of the context in which it was originally written. And we know so often that any words that are taken out of context can completely shift our interpretation of what was intended.
Roxanne, I think about the history of our nation. We are sometimes, again, when we don't educate ourselves and study truly the history of our nation, we kind of forget about, and sometimes we just simply buy onto whatever we've been told. But when you start looking at the Bible and how the Bible at times was misused by people for their own benefit, for their own socio-economic benefit, for their cultural benefit, for their political benefit, and I would argue that sometimes we misuse the Scriptures in a way that benefits ourselves. That we like what we like from the Bible. It's like I heard someone put it this way, if you only take what you like from the Bible and disregard what you don't like from the Bible, it's not the Bible that you believe in. It's just yourself that you believe in.
That's a good line. And
I think that's just how we are. And so the challenge that we have is looking at these Scriptures, looking at St. Paul and saying, okay, look, St. Paul wrote the book of Philippians. Okay, where did he write that book? He wrote it in prison. Okay, so now I understand the setting as best I can, the setting. But let me look about what were the Romans prisons like. So as I'm reading what he's writing, let me try to put myself into his mind, that this is what he was dealing with. He's dealing with torture, abuse, all these different things.
Yeah, what was happening at the time.
Exactly. And then when you hear that, and then you add on the fact, what is he writing about? That he has the courage to, because sometimes, just in natural, whenever, we get sick, we can have a cough and we're like, oh, I don't feel well. And so we kind of let that stuff consume us. Imagine someone like him who's using everything that you could imagine that's going wrong in his life and using it as a motivator for him to write books that would be written in eternity. He's written in writing the books of the Bible. So for me, that's one of the things that just truly inspire me, and having the courage that he does to do that.
And what inspires me about our saints, the saints of our church, is that they were human beings. They were just human. They were you and I. They were human beings, fallible in their own ways, who God used for incredible things. Sometimes we think of, Jesus and we look at him, but we say, well, okay, well, he was also God, he was divine. So how would we ever measure up? But these were human beings. Every one of our saints were human beings. And so something to always sort of remember as we consider, our own fallible natures, but also what is possible, what God can do, through us as we allow our spirits to yield to the work His Holy Spirit is trying to do within us. And do
like Lydia did and open up your heart to Him.
That's right.
So we thank you, Roxanne, for those beautiful questions, and really thanks to all of you for taking the time to be with us this evening. I hope that this show just kind of gives you a little bit of just a kind of a little taste of what our pilgrimage was like. It was such an amazing experience. And thank you for letting me share that with all of you this evening.
I hope that it inspires others to take pilgrimages in their own life. I remember fondly our pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and how still today, even though it was however many years ago, I cannot forget like so many moments that still affect me today.
Absolutely. And we want to thank also Matushka Trudy for producing tonight's show, and all the great people at Ancient Faith. And just want to invite you all again, if you have not or do not receive our daily inspirational messages, do so by going to thelouhs.com/subscribe. And if you're reading our book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, we've gotten so much positive reviews from it. Do us a favor, if you like the book or just want to share your thoughts about it, send us a review by going to Amazon.com and write a review under the book heading of 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, as well as on Ancient Faith. Go to store.ancientfaith.com. Join us next Tuesday, my friends, for a brand new Live with the Louhs. God bless you all and stay strong in your faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.